Good day, watercolor artists. I'm here to demonstrate how to make a picture of a monochromatic mountain lake. Today I'm going to be using a purple color, then with the last step adding just a tiny bit of black. What you'll need for the painting is 140-pound Arches watercolor paper stretched onto a gator board, which is a solid board that will help your paper stay flat. You'll need a wash brush. Here's a simple little paintbrush with natural bristle, a mop brush, and a number 10 or 12 round brush. This is what I use, the Simply Simmons. You'll need lots of water. So prep your paper by soaking it in a cookie pan for 20 minutes. Lay it on your gator board. Smooth out the paper with a very clean wash rag. Then staple starting at the end and the other end. Then at each side. Then staple 1 inch apart all the way around. Let the paper dry overnight or in the sun. You'll need to measure out about 1/4 cup of water with your chosen color. You could use purple or black or green or orange, you choose. And your first step after everything's dry is to trace onto your paper the design of your mountains. I've done a layering picture so that some mountains, the ones in the back, will be lighter due to the atmosphere. The ones in the front will be darkest. This line here shows the shoreline, and the straight lines are the trees. I've placed them in my scene so that I don't make tree farms or rows of trees that are all the same. The bottom part that you see here is the reflection of the mountains in the lake. Start by putting an arrow at the top of your paper so that you know which way is up. Draw it lightly enough so that you can still erase it. I'm doing my work here a little darker than I normally would, just so you can see what I'm doing. I'm taking my wash brush, loading it with water, and crossing over my paper and collecting more water as it gets dry. Then going the opposite way to make sure that there are no holidays on the paper. You want it wet enough so that it's very shiny, as you can see here, but not so wet that the water is dripping and falling off onto the table. So I've got a little bit of water dripping down, but I think that's going to be fine. So now I take my first wash with my paint that's already been prepared. If you haven't prepared your paint, you might want to stop and do that. Then re-wet your paper just to make sure that it's wet enough. You do not want dry paper. Starting at the top, sweep across your paper several times before collecting more paint. Once you've got your paint on, do not go back and try to add more paint. You'll end up with some places dry and some places wet, and then you'll have blooms. Now, once you've got your paint on your paper, you'll notice that it's going to run a bit. So you need to rock and roll your painting until all the paint is absorbed into the paper. So you're going to rock and roll until you don't see the paint moving from one side to the other. Move it right to left, front to back. Top to bottom. It is possible to take and just move that paint into dry areas if there are any. But don't go back through and touch in the middle. You'll end up with weird little marks. Once it gets to the color you like, you can drain off your paint onto your paint safe surface. You could use a garbage bag, a plastic garbage bag, if you've got a nice wood table you're working on, or Formica that you don't want to stain. I'm still dripping a little bit, and it's still shiny, so I'm going to keep rocking and rolling it for a little while longer so that I don't see lots of paint collecting here at the bottom. See how there's paint collecting at the bottom? And to collect that up, I can take the very edge of my paper towel and just touch it. You don't blot it because you'll end up with dry marks. Now this I would go set out in the sun because it's ready. The paint's not moving anymore. You can also, once it's to this point, take it to the hairdryer. I'm still moving a little bit, so I'm going to keep tipping until the paint doesn't move anymore. Okay, I'm going to call that good. Setting it to the side, or taking it outside. Now we have the next step. This is my dried paper. Everything's dry, and when you feel it, it's going to feel slightly warm, not cool to the touch. Looking at our picture here, we notice that there are lots of intersecting lines, and on the design that I've given to my classes, I've written 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3. So this is the top line. So I'm going to call that 1. And I'm going to start here and take paint all the way up to that area, all the way down to this area. And I'm just making these marks here, 1, this means 1, so that I can see where I'm going to go. And again, you go to your prepared paint. You should still have lots of paint left over. And go ahead and add another layer of this very same paint. Notice when you put the second layer on, how it makes it a little darker. You want to move quickly enough so that the water and the paper stay moist. You want to work slowly enough so that you're carefully touching all the lines. Again, my lines are a little darker than yours will be. Once again, you do not want to touch your brush to your paper once you've already got the paint on it. So I don't want to go back up in this area here to put more paint on it. If I do, it creates some weird blooms. Sometimes you want to make a bloom. This is one of those times when you don't. So here again, we rock and roll until the paint stops moving. If you stop moving the paint, you'll create a bloom where the wet paint moves into the dry area and creates a bloom. You just have to be patient. This is called watching paint dry. I've got an area here I'm wanting to fill in. It's dry there, but you don't want to put your brush in there because it'll create some other issues. I've got a little problem right here. And I'm going to very carefully add just a tiny bit of paint to that area. But again, I'm not following my own rules here. As soon as I do that, I know I may end up with some blooms. Once it stops moving, the paint stops rolling around on the paper, you can either dry it with a hairdryer, or, I'm doing this in August, you can set it out in the sun. Okay, I've got another painting here ready to go. Notice on this one, I've used some blue painter's tape to remind myself not to paint in this area, this mountain, because it's the farthest away. In this mountain, or this reflection, or this part of the reflection, I'm only going to paint along the top lines all the way up, and I'm going to go up in this area all the way down to this area, going across and avoiding this area right here. Don't paint there. And go along up here. Okay, so you've still got your paint ready. That's why I had you make so much. And again, quickly getting the paint on your paper. Now, the first time I did this, you notice how it dried here in this first section. So I'm going to apply a little more water there just so I don't end up with a dry spot. And I want to keep my brush pretty wet. See, it says 1 and 2 there, so I know that this is the second application, the second layer. Again down here. If you end up with a hair on your paper, you can take a dry brush and just flick it off. Just flicking off some little hairs that appeared from the atmosphere. Remember to work quickly because you don't want your lines to dry. If these lines dry, then you'll end up with a hard edge, it's called. And we don't want any hard edges within each layer. Okay, here we go. Notice again, we ended up with a darker color, even though that was the same pile of paint. That we used on the first 3 layers. This is the 3rd layer here. And again, rock and roll till the paint stops moving. Camera needs to be bigger or farther away. Once that paint stops rolling around, then I can stop rolling it, or I can just leave it to roll off into a paper towel. Okay, step 3 is done. Now step 4, I've done this, got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pictures here that I've painted each step along the way. All right, here we go. These look all a little different, so if you notice a difference in color, that's why I've done each one separately, prepping it to go. Now on this one, this is my 3rd layer actually it's the fourth layer of paint on this paper. This was the first where I did the whole sheet. The second was where I did this outside edges. Then I did the third one. And now I'm going to do this section here. I'm going to use my tape again so that I am going to, so that I know to avoid certain areas. I only want paint in this center section. And the tape just helps me remember not to paint there. Okay, here we go. See this center section? I'm going now to my smaller brush. When you have a brush that you're using, you want to use the bigger brush for bigger areas, the smaller brush for smaller areas. Now we're doing the closest set of heels to where we're standing. Notice how this brush collects water a little differently. It is a synthetic brush, so the synthetic brush doesn't collect or save as much water as the natural hair bristles that I was using with my mop brush. That was goat hair, and so even though it's a stiff goat hair, it does collect better water than this synthetic. However, the synthetic is nice because it's a little stiffer and you have a little more control with where the water goes. This time I'm using much less paint, but I'm still going to want to rock and roll to make sure the paint dries evenly. When it doesn't dry evenly, that's when you end up with interesting blooms where you might not have wanted them. Now sometimes blooms are good, but in this case I want this to be smooth, smooth, smooth. As I look at this, the paint is pretty still. I'm gonna, even though it's shiny, there's a nice even coat. Now look how the paint is all falling down here to the bottom. Gravity's pulling it down. That isn't dry enough. So let me tip it the other way and do a sneak preview of my finished project. I'm using a paper that's about the size of 8.5 by 11. So it's a nice, easy size to work with. Your common size that you can use for framing, an 11 by 14 inch frame. The inside is usually 7.5 by 9.5 inches. So this size translates very nicely down into a size that you can frame pretty cheaply. Okay, I've got another hair there. So as you remember, you take a dry brush, here we go, and go underneath it and flick it out. Got it out. That takes just a little bit of practice. Okay, now I'm going to go on to the next step. Which is it's all dry. The place where I'm going to make my line of trees all the way across. And I don't need my little pieces of tape anymore to remind me not to paint. I'm just going to go straight across here and make some trees. Now there's some very technical language with this. I call it squiggly wiggly trees, and pulling out a brush that I didn't mention at the very beginning. This is a number 6 brush. This provides me with a little more, a smaller surface to work with. So this is where we're going to take and make our shoreline and squiggly wiggly the trees, and then at the reflection is not going to be quite as tree shaped. It's going to be a little more random. Again, squiggly wiggly. Squiggly wiggly. There's a nice big tall tree. Again, you don't want your trees to be like a tree farm. So notice how there's more coverage of the paint on the paper above the shoreline and less underneath the shore as the reflection in the water. Bring your shoreline across as you make your trees. Sometimes your tree might just be a line. You want different sizes of trees. I'm going to pretend like these are all Douglas firs. And the trees could run into each other. And as you do each tree, bring your shoreline across so that, again, there's no hard edges. You'll want to practice your trees on little pieces of paper before you try this. Every once in a while I go back and grab more paint. When you grab more paint, make sure that it doesn't have too much coming off onto the brush so that it makes a big blob. See how this has got a big blob? Wipe it on the side of the paint palette or the paint pan so that it doesn't make too big a blob. Squiggly wiggly. Continue your shoreline. Here's a little one. Another little one that's a little bigger. And we're coming to what I call bushes. Above the shoreline, the bushes are going to be a little more solid. But again, the squiggly wiggly technique is good. And you can just kind of make a nice shape of the trees, taller, bigger, some bigger, or the bushes, some bigger, some smaller. And then underneath, you want to leave a little bit of the water showing through. I have what I call a try paper here. This is a little paper that you try your color on, your amount of paint on, if you like the color, if you like how much paint you've got there. It just is very helpful to try it before you actually put it on your paper and go, oops. These trees don't have to be perfect. So don't stress about them, just let them be. As Bob Ross says, they're just happy little trees living in the forest, happy to be in the mountains. we go. Okay, now the next thing that I wanted to show you is something that I call lifting. And that's taking a little bit of water. Here again, I pulled out another brush that I didn't tell you about, and making a little line of water. You can kind of see that. And count to 20. Then you're going to take a Kleenex and a stiff brush, and this is a chisel brush. I like the chisel brush for this kind of thing because it's kind of skinny and sharp. It's a synthetic, and you take and wipe, and then you wipe the paint that you've pulled off onto a Kleenex. Do it again, wipe. And the last, after you've done it a couple times, you can blot it once. Again, I'm going to try another one. It's important not to do too many at once because it's easy to forget where you've put your waves sparkling on the water. So here is one. Wipe it off of the paper, then dry it on your paper towel. And after you've done it 3 or 4 times, then you can use your finger and press. It's not going to go back to white, but depending on what kind of paint you use, watercolor paints, some are staining, and they will stain the paper, so you can't get them off very well at all, but some are not, and they will pull up a certain degree. You wouldn't want to go all the way back to white, I wouldn't think, because that would be too jarring. You'll notice that you can see where I'm pulling up the paint a little more easily on the darker sections. Especially there, I can see it right there. Now I'm going to go back to my paint, the dark paint, and just put in a few little ripples that are dark. Especially right where I'd been working on lifting. This looks a little dark, so I'm just going to blot it gently. My granddaughter did this project with me the other day, and she ended up with a big black blob here. And so she just put a little boat there in the lake. Okay, there we go. I think we're done. Monochromatic mountain lake.